Aquila, Chapter 5. The front page of the Sunday Mirror next morning came as something of a shock to both boys. Jeff was helping his father put out the papers in the shop when he saw the set of exclusive pictures of a UFO spotted 7 miles south of Staveley all over the front page. Aquila's shape, with Tom inside, was clearly recognizable. He showed the paper to his father, who read the article aloud in between serving customers. Mr. Reynolds had long believed that the Earth was being visited by aliens from space, and the story confirmed his theory that they were up to no good in the process. According to the newspaper, a birdwatcher called Brian Bovis had seen a strange machine fly down and hover in the air at a road junction outside Halterworth. From his hiding place in the woods, he had hurriedly lined up his camera for a picture, only to see the alien craft shoot up into the air where, using what Mr. Bovis described as some sort of power beam, it had rooted out a row of telegraph poles and sent them hurtling back to Earth in an obvious attempt to kill him before he could tell anyone what he had seen. On the inside pages of the paper, there were more pictures. One was of the telegraph pole, which had landed in the earth centimeters from where Mr. Bovis had been standing, and another, 50 meters away, had speared his motorcycle to the ground like a cocktail sausage. The photos of Aquila were rather blurred, as Mr. Bovis's camera had unfortunately been focused to take close-ups of a feeding hedge warbler, but you could just make out the small head and big dark eyes of the alien creature that sat inside. "Wouldn't like to meet him on a dark night." Mr. Reynolds studied the photo closely. "Nasty piece of work, that." He passed the paper back to Jeff and went off to serve another customer. After breakfast, Jeff took it round to show Tom. "You never said anything about telegraph poles and a power beam," he said. "How did you do it?" Tom did not reply. As it happened, he had some rather alarming news of his own. The police had come to his house early that morning to ask Mrs. Baxter if she had seen any flying saucers in her garden recently. Flying saucers? The look of worry on Mrs. Baxter's face deepened. "What do you mean?" "We had some reports yesterday about something in the sky," the sergeant explained, "and then a phone call from someone who says they saw it land on your lawn." "You're saying somebody saw me land?" said Jeff, when Tom told him about it. "Yes, but it might be all right. It was only Mrs. Murphy." Mrs. Murphy was the old lady who lived on her own in the house next door to Tom's. They got the doctor round, and he said it was probably a side effect of this new medicine she's been taking for her depression. "So nobody believed her?" Tom shook his head. "I don't think so. But it might be safest if we kept Aquila indoors for a few days, at least in the daytime." It was disappointing, but Tom had to agree it was the only sensible thing to do. Sitting in the garage, he gently floated Aquila a few meters up and down and side to side, while Tom read the article in the Sunday Mirror. According to the paper, the damage to the telephone lines was estimated at hundreds of pounds, and when Tom looked at the pictures, he couldn't help thinking that if the telegraph poles had fallen even a fraction further to the left... "I tell you what," Jeff took out his chewing gum and stuck it on the dash. "If we can't go outside or anything, we could find out what some of these do." He gestured to the lights in front of him. "How?" asked Tom. "Well, we push a few and see what happens." "But we don't know what they'll do." "That's why I'm suggesting we push them," Jeff explained patiently, "so we'd know." "But that could be dangerous." Tom was still thinking about his near miss on the birdwatcher, and the skin under his right eye flickered faintly. Jeff shrugged. "I think it'd probably be all right. I mean, you wouldn't design something like this to kill whoever was inside it, would you?" "I don't know," said Tom, "but He stopped. "Are we going forwards?" Jeff leaned over the side to peer at the floor and found Aquila was, very slowly, floating towards the door. He looked at the dashboard and saw his chewing gum had dribbled down over the forward control. He peeled it off and flicked the button back out with his fingernail. "I tell you what, we'll just try one of them. I mean, one wouldn't do any harm, would it?" Tom was not entirely convinced by this. "It's just to see what happens." Jeff put the chewing gum back in his mouth. "We'll probably find it turns on the heater or something." He pointed to a small blue light in the far corner. "This one looks pretty harmless. Let's try that." And before Tom could say anything, Jeff reached out a thumb and pressed firmly at the light. Nothing happened. The boys looked round and Jeff pressed again. There was a faint smell in the air that Tom couldn't quite place, but otherwise nothing had changed. His relief mingled with a slight sense of disappointment. Okay, I'll try this one. Jeff reached out a finger to a large disc in the center of the dashboard that glowed a luminescent yellow. I thought you said one button. One button that works, protested Jeff. There's not much point doing it unless we find one that works, is there? Where are you going? Tom was climbing out of Aquila. I'm sorry, he said firmly. If you want to risk getting killed, you can do it on your own. I'm going over there. Out of the way. He went to stand by the wall at the back of the garage, his arms folded. Honestly, I don't know what you're worrying about. Jeff shook his head. Nothing's going to happen. He gave Tom a brief smile, pressed down with his finger, and both he and Aquila disappeared. Standing at the sink in the kitchen, peeling potatoes, Mrs. Baxter was worrying about her neighbor, Mrs. Murphy. The old lady has not been in good health for some time. She was lonely. She had trouble with her legs, and now she was seeing spaceships land in the garden. Some years before, when Mrs. Baxter had first moved to Staveley, Mrs. Murphy's kindness had helped her through a difficult time. Now, it seemed, she was in need of help herself, and Mrs. Baxter would have liked very much to give it. She would have liked to call round, to ask if she could help with the shopping, to sit down and talk over a coffee. But she couldn't. Mrs. Baxter's agoraphobia had started as nothing more than a vague reluctance to go out of the house. She had found she disliked being in crowds, that traveling on public transport made her nervous, and that she only felt really comfortable and secure in the privacy of her own home. Over the months, the reluctance to leave had become stronger until now the truth was that she had not set so much as a foot outside her house for nearly 3 years. Anything she needed, she ordered over the phone or from catalogs, and Tom collected any items that could not be delivered. It was an arrangement that had seemed largely satisfactory, until now. She could at least phone, Mrs. Baxter thought, as she put the saucepan of potatoes on the cooker. She could ring and ask her neighbor how she was feeling and find out exactly what the doctor had said. And she was reaching for the phone when she noticed the garden fence was on fire. Eager flames were licking hungrily up one of the wooden panels at the bottom of the garden, and as she watched, Mrs. Baxter heard a dull booming sound at Mrs. Murphy's shed, just the other side of the fence, as it went up in a ball of fire. With trembling fingers, she dialed 999 and asked for the fire brigade. In the garage, it was very quiet. Tom stared at the emptiness around him with a sick feeling in his stomach. Jeff? He called weakly. What's happened? I don't understand. Jeff's disembodied voice came from somewhere in the middle of the room. It's got a light on. It must be there to do something. Tom looked round. Jeff's voice sounded perfectly normal, but there was no Jeff. There was nobody in the garage but himself. Jeff, are you there? I'll try it again. For a moment, Jeff and Aquila were back. Jeff, with a finger poised over the yellow button, looked disappointedly round. What a letdown! He pressed the button again and disappeared. I think I'll try another one. Jeff! Tom shouted from his place at the back of the garage. Please, don't touch anything! Tom reached behind him and grabbed a spade that had been leaning against the back wall. He picked it up and stepped cautiously forwards. What are you doing? There was a note of concern in Jeff's voice, but Tom ignored him. Edging round to the side of where Aquila had been, he lifted the spade and let it fall. It stopped in midair with a clanging sound, a meter or so above the ground. Have you gone mad? You'll damage the paint. Jeff stood up in Aquila and stared down at Tom. At least, Tom presumed he was standing up. All he could actually see was Jeff's body down to his waist. Below that, his legs and Aquila were still invisible. What do you think you're doing? By way of reply, Tom simply pointed, and Jeff looked down. For a moment, he froze in astonishment, but then he reached down, dipping a hand into the emptiness. It disappeared. When he lifted the hand out, it was back again. Hang on a minute. Jeff disappeared completely as he sat down, and a moment later, both he and Aquila had reappeared. His finger was poised over the yellow light. You can see me now? Yes. And now I've gone again? Right. Oh, wow! Aquila became visible again, and Jeff's face was wreathed in smiles. Oh, wow! This is cool. You know what we have here? If Tom knew, he did not reply. He was staring thoughtfully at the spade he still held in his hand. In the center, there was a small hole about 2 centimeters across, and judging by the dribbles of melted metal that had formed at its base, it had been made by something extremely hot. He went to the back of the garage, to the place where the spade had been leaning against the wall, and knelt down. A few centimeters above the ground, he could see an identical circular hole drilled through the brickwork, its side as smooth as glass. It went right through the wall, and he could see fronds of ivy on the other side, blowing in the wind. "I don't believe this!" Jeff was half standing in an invisible Aquila, slowly bobbing up and down to watch his body vanish, then reappear. "Just as well you stayed outside, isn't it?" Tom was not really listening. "I mean, if you hadn't stayed outside," Jeff went on, "we'd have just thought it was like the first button and didn't work at all." "I wouldn't be too sure of that," Tom stood up. "What?" "About the first button not working." He held up the spade for Jeff to see, and as he did so, both boys caught the sound of fire engines getting closer. There were 11 fires in all. 4 garden fences, Mrs. Murphy's shed, a sun lounger, a tree, 3 bushes, and a basket of washing. All of them were still vigorously burning when the fire brigade arrived. The fire chief was understandably puzzled that 11 separate fires should have broken out in half a dozen gardens at exactly the same time, but he decided eventually that the fire in the garden shed must have started all the others. An exploding petrol can, he believed, had showered its contents over the fences to start the fires on either side. It seemed plausible, and it was certainly a lot more plausible than Mrs. Murphy's claim that the fires had been started by a laser cannon from the spaceship she had seen the previous day. It was not an idea that anyone else took seriously, though it was curious, as a police constable pointed out, that all 11 fires were in an exact straight line. "I think it might be best if we didn't try any more buttons for a while," said Tom. "And for the moment," Jeff agreed. That afternoon they took Aquila out on its first invisible flight around Staveley, and Jeff stopped over the park to perform a brief experiment. Hovering a couple of 100 meters above the lake with Aquila's nose pointing slightly downwards, Jeff stabbed briefly at the blue button again. The beam of light that appeared from the back of Aquila was bright enough to dazzle, but what most impressed the boys was the way it seemed to go on and on and on. It was there for only a fraction of a second, but it seemed to stretch up into the sky forever. Tom had the feeling that if it met a satellite 40,000 miles up, it would punch a neat 2-centimeter hole through it as easily as it had through the garage wall. They had, when he thought about it, been rather lucky. If Aquila had been pointing a different way, if the laser beam had shot through a row of houses instead of gardens, if it had gone through people instead of fences. Jeff was less worried, and he was still curious about what the other lights on Aquila might do. But for now he was prepared to concede that it would be wiser in the short term not to conduct any more experiments. What they already knew Aquila could do was exciting enough for the moment. Mrs. Baxter sat in her kitchen, and for once she was feeling not so much worried as angry. It was bad enough when you couldn't leave your house to go and help an old friend and neighbor, she thought, but when you couldn't even go outside with a bucket of water to try and stop your own property burning down, then it was time something was done.